Nate handed me the divorce papers on a Tuesday in the parking lot of the restaurant where he'd proposed 6 years earlier. He was smiling when he did it. He told me I should be grateful he'd waited until after the holidays, like restraint was a gift he was giving me. Then he straightened his jacket, got into his car, and drove back to the office he genuinely believed belonged to him. What he didn't know was that I still had a folder in the back of my closet with my maiden name typed neatly on the tab, and that folder was about to end his career faster than any affair ever could.
Welcome to Revenge Love Story,
where quiet women turn out to be the ones holding all the paperwork. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who mistook your silence for surrender, drop a comment and hit subscribe. You're gonna want to see how this one ends. Let me take you back to where it actually started. My name is Alina Calloway Marsh. I was 34 years old and I worked as a paralegal at a mid-sized law firm downtown, the kind of job where nobody looks twice at you in the elevator, where you spend your days making other people's disasters look organized on paper. I liked it that way. I'd grown up the quiet one in a loud family, and after I married Nate, I liked being nobody in particular even more. I filed motions, I built binders, I noticed details other people skimmed past, because noticing details was the entire job. Nate never learned how good I was at that until it was far too late to matter to him. A few months before any of this started, one of the senior partners at my firm handed me a case file that 3 other paralegals had already given up on, a commercial dispute buried under 11 years of amended contracts, half of them contradicting each other. I spent 4 straight nights building a single timeline that reconciled every amendment, and when I handed it over, the partner told me it was the cleanest reconstruction he'd seen in 20 years of practice. I didn't think about that compliment again until the week Mr. Whitfield asked me to reconstruct an entirely different kind of timeline, one with my own name in it instead of a stranger's. We'd been married 8 years by the time the papers arrived. In the early ones, I did what a lot of wives do without thinking of it as sacrifice at the time. I covered our rent for the first 14 months of our marriage while he finished his MBA at night. I co-signed a $41,000 loan so he could take the unpaid internship that got him the door at Callaway Textiles. I drove 2 hours each way every other weekend so he could stay home and study instead of visiting his parents with me. I skipped my own cousin's destination wedding because we couldn't afford both the trip and his licensing exam fee that same month. None of it felt like keeping score at the time. It just felt like marriage, the ordinary math of building something together. Nate was easy to love in those years. He had the specific kind of charm that made rooms lean toward him without quite knowing why, the kind that made his mother's friends say, even back then, that he'd go far. And he did go far. He climbed at Callaway Textiles fast. Junior analyst, then operations lead, then in under 9 years, vice president of operations at just 36. He liked to say it during the lean years, back when the loan payments felt heavy and we ate cereal for dinner twice a week. "You'll never have to worry about money once you're with me." He said it so often that it became a kind of vow between us, a phrase I could still hear in his exact cadence years later. I believed him completely. That was the only mistake, if there was one, believing a promise instead of watching carefully what a person does with power once he finally has some of his own. My family's relationship to Callaway Textiles was something I'd never once explained to Nate in any real detail, mostly because it never seemed relevant. My grandfather founded the company in 1978 with a single loom, a bank loan, and a stubborn refusal to sell even a controlling share to outside investors when the business finally started growing in the mid-90s. By the time he passed, the company employed close to 400 people across 2 states, and ownership had quietly passed down through the family in the kind of understated way old money sometimes does, not through press releases, but through folders, filings, and a handful of shareholder meetings nobody outside the family ever attended. My mother held the largest single stake. I held a smaller one, inherited outright, that I'd never once thought to mention at dinner parties. Nate knew in a general sense that my maiden name was Calloway, and that Calloway Textiles was sort of my family's old company. He never once asked to see the paperwork. I never once offered to show him. Nate's mother, Carol, had never fully hidden the sense that I'd married slightly above my apparent station, despite never once knowing the actual details of my family's finances. She used to make small comments at holidays, noting, for instance, that Nate could have had his pick of anyone once he made VP, or that I was lucky he'd stuck with someone so quiet through the early lean years. I used to let those comments roll past me, assuming they were harmless vanity on behalf of a mother proud of her son. Looking back, I think Carol had been quietly auditioning replacements for me for years before Bianca ever arrived, and I simply hadn't been paying attention to that particular pattern yet. The seed of the betrayal was so small, I almost let it pass. About 2 years ago, Nate started mentioning a new marketing coordinator named Bianca Reyes. Talented, he said, great instincts with clients, 29 years old, recently transferred from the Chicago office. He mentioned her name the way you'd mention any coworker, until he mentioned her 4 separate times over one dinner, and the 4th mention was the one that didn't need to exist. I didn't accuse him of anything. I just started paying closer attention, the way I would with a case file that didn't add up yet. Over the following months, small things shifted, one at a time, each one deniable on its own. He started working late, specifically on Thursdays, every single Thursday without fail. He bought a new cologne and didn't mention it, though I noticed the box in the recycling. He stopped inviting me to the smaller client dinners he used to insist I attend, the ones where he'd tell people, arm around my shoulder, that everyone loved having me there. Then, over 4 months, our joint savings account, the one earmarked for a house down payment, the one we'd both agreed not to touch, dropped by $6,000. When I asked, he said it was consulting fees tied to a side project I'd never heard him mention before that conversation and never heard him mention again. Then came the golf trip. Nate told me in March that he'd been invited on a 3-day company retreat to Scottsdale with 2 other VPs, wives not included this time, corporate's rule, not mine. I found the group photo 2 weeks later on the company's internal newsletter, the one Marcus forwarded to all staff. There were 4 people in the photo. Bianca Reyes was one of them. Nate wasn't wearing a wedding ring in it, though he'd worn it every day of our marriage before that trip, and, I noticed later, stopped wearing it consistently after. A month after that, I found a hotel receipt in his jacket pocket while dropping it at the dry cleaner. A downtown boutique hotel, 11 minutes from our own house, dated a Thursday, itemized with 2 glasses of the same expensive Cabernet he always ordered for me on our anniversary. When I asked, he said it was a client dinner that ran long, and that he'd just crashed there instead of driving home tired. I filed the receipt away in my mind the way I'd file a stray exhibit that didn't fit the case yet, but that I knew, somehow, I'd need eventually. The night I finally asked him directly about the missing $6,000, he barely looked up from his phone. "It's a consulting thing, Elena. I told you already," he said, in the exact tone he used for questions he considered beneath a real answer. When I asked which consulting thing, specifically, since he'd never mentioned any such project before that month, he said I was getting paranoid, and that maybe I should focus on something other than the account statements for once. I remember standing in our kitchen holding a bank printout, feeling, for the first time in 8 years, like a stranger in my own marriage. Each excuse, on its own, was small enough to swallow. Stacked together, they were a pattern I could no longer talk myself out of seeing. There's a detail I want you to remember, because it matters a great deal later. Before my grandmother died, she sat me down with my mother in her kitchen and made me promise something that felt strange to a 26-year-old bride. She told me that no matter what happened in my marriage, I was never, under any circumstances, to move my shares in Callaway Textiles out of my maiden name and into a joint account with my husband. Marsh can have your last name at church, she told me, tapping the table once for emphasis. Callaway keeps its name everywhere else, especially on paper. I didn't fully understand her at the time. I filed the shares away, literally, in a plain manila folder in the back of my bedroom closet, and mostly forgot about them for the better part of a decade. Hold on to that folder. We're coming back to it. That same December, at Carol's annual Christmas dinner, I was seated at the far end of the table near the kitchen door, a seat historically reserved for guests, not family, while Bianca's name came up twice in conversation as someone Nate's mentioning more and more these days lately. You know how these things go. Nobody said anything explicit. Nobody needed to. I drove home that night with my hands tight on the wheel, replaying the seating chart in my head, understanding for the first time just how far the erosion had already spread beyond just Nate himself. The public unraveling happened at the company's winter gala, the one Callaway Textiles throws every December for employees and their families in the ballroom of the old Hensley Hotel downtown. Nate had told me 2 days before that the guest list was tight this year and maybe I should sit this one out. Something in his voice made me want to see the room for myself, so I went anyway, in a navy dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion. I watched my husband walk in with Bianca Reyes on his arm in front of roughly 300 of his colleagues and announce, loud enough for the tables near the stage to hear, that he and Bianca were finally free to be public about this. Someone near the bar actually clapped. His mother, seated as a guest of the CEO's wife, smiled the exact smile of a woman who'd been waiting for this moment for longer than I wanted to think about. She caught my eye across the room once, briefly, and didn't look away first, a small, deliberate cruelty I understood perfectly. A colleague of Nate's, a woman named Priya from the finance team who didn't yet know who I was, asked me, not unkindly, if I'd heard the news about the VP and the new coordinator. Wasn't it romantic in a scandalous kind of way? I told her I'd heard. She asked if I knew the wife. I said I'd met her once or twice. It wasn't a lie, technically. I stood near the coat check in my navy dress, and not one person in that ballroom, not one, knew that the quiet woman by the door had more legal claim on that building than the man currently being applauded on the small stage in front of it. If you've ever been humiliated in a room full of people who should have been on your side, comment one word below, describing exactly how that feels. I'll be reading every single one of them. I didn't make a scene. I collected my coat from the attendant, thanked her, and left before dessert was served. 3 weeks after the gala, I was helping Nate back up his work laptop before what he called a business trip to Denver, a trip that, I'd later confirm through Mr. Whitfield's inquiry, appeared on no calendar at Callaway Textiles, official or otherwise. While the backup ran in the background, a message notification slid quietly across the top of the screen. It was from Bianca. It read, in part, something about how the board would never approve it if they knew everything, and something else about keeping this between us until the timing is right. I didn't know yet what it meant. My first assumption, the obvious one, was that it meant the affair itself, that the board would disapprove of a vice president dating a direct report, the way any reasonable board would. I sat with the laptop open on my knees for a long moment after the backup finished, telling myself that whatever it turned out to be, I already had more than enough reason to leave. I copied the thread to my own drive before I closed the laptop anyway, the same way I'd copy any document I didn't fully understand yet, but suspected I'd need later. Old habits. I'd spent 12 years organizing other people's evidence for a living, and some instincts don't turn off just because the case involves your own marriage. In the 6 weeks between that laptop backup and whatever came next, I didn't confront him. I went to work every day, filed my motions, came home and made dinner most nights out of habit more than appetite. Quietly, without telling anyone, I opened a small individual bank account in my own name at a different bank across town and began redirecting my own paycheck there instead of our joint account. I made copies of our tax returns, our mortgage documents, and the loan paperwork from years earlier and stored them in a drawer at my office instead of at home. I wasn't building a case yet, not exactly. I was just making sure that whatever happened next, I wouldn't be caught flat-footed the way I had been at the gala. 6 weeks later, the papers arrived, served to me by a process server in my own driveway on a Tuesday morning, briefcase and all. Nate filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences, and had his lawyer request spousal support based on what the filing called my limited earning capacity relative to his executive compensation. That same week, our joint checking account was frozen, pending the filing, on his lawyer's advice. My name was quietly removed from our health insurance the following Monday, a fact I only discovered at the pharmacy counter. His mother, who used to send me handwritten birthday cards every March, stopped speaking to me entirely, as though 8 years of holidays had simply been erased. 2 friends from the company, women I'd known since our wedding, stopped returning my texts within days, likely worried, I assumed, about their own positions. For about 9 days, I let myself believe I'd lost everything that mattered. The house felt too large for one person, every room echoing slightly in a way it never had before. I kept setting out 2 coffee mugs out of habit and putting one back in the cabinet, slowly, each morning. The silence felt personal, not neutral, like the house itself had taken a side. I didn't tell anyone at work what was happening. I filed motions during the day and cried in my car in the parking garage before driving home, then washed my face in the bathroom mirror at a gas station so I wouldn't have to explain anything to anyone. I want to be honest about that part, because the part that comes after only means something if the fall itself was real. On the 9th day, my mother called, the first time she'd reached out since the divorce filing became public knowledge inside the company. She didn't ask how I was holding up, not directly. She asked instead whether I still knew where your grandmother's folder was. I told her yes. She said, in the same even tone she'd used my entire childhood to deliver both good news and bad, then you already have everything you need. You've just been too polite to use it. I sat with that sentence for 2 full days before I acted on it. Then on the 11th day, I opened the folder in my closet. I called Mr. Whitfield, our family's longtime general counsel, a man who drafted contracts for my grandfather back when Callaway Textiles was 3 buildings and a single warehouse, instead of a corporation with 400 employees. I hadn't spoken to him directly in nearly 6 years. He remembered my name before I'd finished introducing myself. I laid it out for him plainly, the way I'd lay out any case file. My husband, a vice president at the company my family had founded, was in what looked like an ongoing relationship with a subordinate employee. He was hiding money, and he was now trying to extract spousal support from a woman he assumed had nothing of her own to stand on. Mr. Whitfield listened without interrupting, the way good lawyers do, and when I finished, he was quiet long enough that I asked if he was still on the line. "I'm here," he said. "I'm just deciding how to say this so you understand how serious it is." Then he asked me one question. "Elena," he said, "do you still have your original shareholder certificate, the one issued under Callaway before the marriage?" I did. It was sitting in the folder exactly where my grandmother told me to leave it. 41,200 shares, non-marital property, inherited directly from my grandfather's estate, never converted to joint ownership at any point across 8 years of marriage. What Mr. Whitfield told me next changed the entire shape of what was happening to me. Buried in the original 1978 founding charter, a document my grandfather had drafted by hand before the company ever took on an outside investor, was a clause almost nobody at the company remembered still existed. Mr. Whitfield explained that my grandfather had written it in the wake of a hostile takeover attempt in the mid-1980s, when a rival textile firm tried to buy up enough scattered shares to force an executive shakeup from the outside. He'd never forgotten how close the company came to losing control of its own leadership decisions, and he built a permanent safeguard into the charter afterward. Any termination, promotion, or executive-level contract renewal above the director tier required unanimous written sign-off from every shareholder holding above a 2% stake. It was meant to protect the company from outsiders. Nobody, including my grandfather, had ever imagined it might one day protect a family member from someone who'd married into it. My shares, sitting untouched in that folder for 8 quiet years, put me at just over 3%. Nate had been promoted to vice president 11 months earlier without that sign-off ever being sought. Nobody had opened the old charter in decades. Certainly nobody expected the relevant shareholder to be the vice president's own wife, filing paperwork in a downtown law office 3 miles from his corner window. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. Not that day. I asked Mr. Whitfield to draft a formal notice. The notice went out on a Thursday, fittingly the same day of the week Nate used to claim he was working late. Mr. Whitfield insisted on hand-delivering a physical copy to the corporate secretary's office, in addition to the certified mail version, so there's no version of this story where anyone claims that got lost. It was addressed to the full board of directors, copying the CEO and outside general counsel, and it stated plainly, without a single unnecessary word, that shareholder Elena Calloway was formally exercising her rights under Article 14 of the original founding charter. It requested a full board review of the Vice President of Operations promotion history and current conduct, pending an internal ethics inquiry into a documented relationship with a direct report. Attached to it, per Mr. Whitfield's recommendation, were copies of the original certificate, the relevant charter language, and a dated summary of the account transfers I'd already gathered on my own. Nate learned about the letter the same afternoon it landed on the CEO's desk. I know because his assistant, a young man named Marcus, who'd always been kind to me at company events, called that evening to gently warn me that Nate had thrown his phone across his own office hard enough to crack the screen. "I'm not supposed to call you," Marcus said quietly, "but I figured you'd want to know he's telling people the letter is fake, and I didn't think that was fair to let stand." I thanked him and told him he didn't have to worry about being caught between us. He said, a little sadly, that he already was. For the first time in months, my husband was frightened. He called me 11 times over 2 days. I didn't answer any of them. If you've ever waited years for someone to finally sound afraid of losing something, comment below on how long you waited, because I waited 8, and I still wasn't prepared for how quiet it would feel when it finally happened. Instead of answering, I watched something unfold that I hadn't fully anticipated. He turned to Bianca to help him quietly manage the board's reaction, and Bianca, it turned out, had reasons of her own to panic that had nothing to do with me. Here's the part none of us saw coming, myself included, and I was the one holding the folder. Bianca hadn't only been involved with my husband, she'd also been quietly passing advance notice of the company's unreleased quarterly earnings to the chief financial officer, a man twice her age who'd been trading on that information in a private brokerage account for the better part of a year. The message thread I'd copied months earlier, the one referencing the board would never approve it if they knew everything, hadn't been about the affair at all. It had been about the earnings leak the entire time. My husband's affair, as humiliating as it was, turned out to be the smaller secret hiding a considerably larger one underneath it. If you think you already know where this story is going, comment "I didn't see that coming" below, because neither did I, and I'd read every page of that laptop's message thread twice. The board called an emergency session for the following Monday morning. Mr. Whitfield asked if I wanted to appear only by proxy, quietly through counsel, the way most shareholders in my position would choose to. I told him no. I wanted to be in the room. I walked into that boardroom in the same navy dress I'd worn to the winter gala, except this time, nobody clapped when I entered. The room went silent instead. 12 executives and 2 outside council members, watching a woman most of them had only ever seen at holiday parties, standing where a shareholder stands. Nate was already seated at the far end of the long table, his tie loosened at the collar, his composure fraying at the edges in a way I had genuinely never once seen in 8 years of marriage. Bianca sat 2 seats from the CFO, both of them very carefully not looking at each other or at me. The CEO, a measured man named Robert Ashford, who'd known my grandfather personally, opened the meeting by acknowledging, for the record, that shareholder notice under Article 14 had been properly filed, and that the board was legally obligated to hear the matter in full before any other business proceeded. I watched Nate's jaw tighten at the phrase, properly filed, as though some small part of him had assumed, until that exact moment, that the letter had been a bluff. I didn't raise my voice, not once. I laid out the timeline the way I'd been trained to for 12 years. Dates, dollar amounts, and documents, one after another, without a single adjective doing any of the work for me. I noted the $6,000 quietly moved from our shared savings account under a fabricated consulting label. I noted the promotion that had never received the shareholder approval required, in writing, by the charter my own grandfather had drafted by hand nearly 50 years earlier. I noted the message thread referencing information the board would never approve and handed a printed copy to the outside auditor sitting in at the CEO's specific request. Then, I said the one thing Nate had whispered to me on our hardest nights for 8 straight years, the phrase he used like a promise every time money felt tight between us. You'll never have to worry about money once you're with me. I told the board, calmly, that my husband had turned out to be right, in a way he never once intended. I never had to worry about the money. It had simply never belonged to him to take in the first place. Nate tried to speak twice during the meeting and was overruled both times by outside counsel, who reminded him, gently but firmly, that he was a subject of the inquiry, not a participant in deciding its outcome. The one time he was allowed a brief statement near the end, his voice cracked in a way I'd genuinely never heard him from before, not once in 8 years. He said he'd spent his whole life terrified of staying ordinary, the way his own father had stayed ordinary, working the same mid-level job for 30 years without ever once being noticed for it, and that some part of him had convinced himself that trading up, the title, the office, eventually Bianca, was the only proof he had that he'd escaped that fate. It was the most honest sentence I'd heard him say in over a year, and it didn't change a single fact in the folder in front of me. One of the longer-serving board members, a woman named Diane, who'd sat on the board since before I was born, looked at me for a long moment after I finished and said only, "Your grandfather would have run this meeting exactly the way you just did." I didn't respond to that. I didn't trust my voice enough yet to try. The auditor's internal review, launched that same week, moved faster than I expected. Investigators pulled phone records, calendar entries, and trading logs from the CFO's personal brokerage account, cross-referencing the timing of his trades against the exact dates Bianca's messages referenced internal earnings data. Within 9 business days, the pattern was undeniable enough that outside counsel recommended immediate action. The CFO resigned before he could be formally terminated, facing a securities inquiry that was, thankfully, no longer any concern of mine to track. Bianca was released from the company for cause, her severance forfeited entirely under the company's own written conduct clause. Nate's promotion was formally rescinded pending a separate internal ethics review, and 3 weeks later, facing a demotion back to a role 2 full levels below the one he'd held for years, he chose to resign instead of accepting it. When his lawyer reached out afterward, quietly, suggesting we handle the remainder privately out of respect for what we used to have, I said no, through Mr. Whitfield, without hesitation. His lawyer pushed once more, noting that Mr. Marsh would prefer to avoid further embarrassment for both parties. Mr. Whitfield's written reply was 3 sentences long and, I thought, perfectly reasonable. My terms were not up for negotiation, the embarrassment in question had been entirely self-inflicted, and any further communication should come through counsel only. I stated my terms plainly, a standard division of marital assets under our state's law, nothing more and nothing less, and my Callaway shares remaining exactly where they had always been, under my own name, entirely untouched. No spousal support, no further contact through anyone but counsel, ever again. 6 months later, the pieces settled where they settled. Nate accepted a director-level role at a smaller competitor 2 states away, 2 full levels below where he'd stood at Callaway Textiles, at a salary he apparently no longer discusses with anyone from our old life. Marcus mentioned once, without me asking, that Nate had told colleagues at his exit interview that he was leaving to pursue new opportunities, which struck me as the first honest thing he'd said in over a year, in its own accidental way. Bianca's name surfaced once more in a regulatory filing connected to the CFO's ongoing securities case, listed only as a person with knowledge of the trading activity who cooperated with investigators in exchange for not facing charges herself. I heard secondhand, through Marcus, that she relocated to Ohio not long after and no longer works in marketing at all. The CFO's case is still moving through the process as far as I know, though it stopped being any concern of mine the moment the auditor's report went final. Marcus, Nate's old assistant, still texts me every year on my birthday, which I find quietly touching given he owed me nothing at all. Mr. Whitfield retired from active practice that spring, but still calls me twice a year, mostly just to ask how I'm doing, and once, unprompted, to tell me my grandfather would have been proud of how I'd handled the board. My mother, who stayed remarkably quiet through the entire ordeal out of respect for how I wanted to handle it, told me afterward that my grandmother would have been unbearably smug about the whole thing, and she was almost certainly right about that. I still work at the same law firm downtown. Nobody there knows a single detail about the boardroom, and I prefer it exactly that way. I've thought a lot, since then, about how much of myself I quietly folded away during those 8 years. Not just the shares, but the version of me who noticed things and said nothing, who filed away small inconsistencies instead of asking about them out loud. I don't think I'll make that particular mistake again in this marriage or any other, but every quarter, when the shareholder reports arrive by mail, I open the folder in the back of my closet, the one with my maiden name typed neatly on the tab, and I read the numbers slowly, the same patient way my grandmother once taught me to read anything that actually mattered. I started mentoring 2 of the newer paralegals at my firm that spring, mostly because a partner asked, but partly because I liked the idea of teaching someone else to notice inconsistencies before they became someone else's entire marriage. I reconnected with my cousin, the one whose destination wedding I'd missed all those years ago for Nate's exam fee. I flew out for her daughter's christening instead, and nobody at that gathering seated me near the kitchen door. Here's what I learned from all of it, the one sentence I genuinely want you to take with you. Some people spend an entire marriage carefully counting what they assume they'll walk away with, and never once think to check whose name was actually on the paperwork the whole time. I don't tell this story because I want anyone to feel sorry for the 8 years that came before the folder. I tell it because I think a lot of us are sitting on some version of our own quiet leverage, a document, a skill, a fact we've simply never had a reason to use yet, and we won't know its value until the day someone forces our hand. If this story meant something to you, subscribe, because tomorrow another quiet woman finds the folder nobody thought to check. And I want to know, if you discovered tomorrow that the company your spouse worked for was quietly, legally still yours, what's the very first thing you do with that? Tell me in the comments below. I read every one of them.